Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special Friday night episode of Gemini Rising. My name is Natalie Sadie, for those of you joining us for the very first time. And as always, my co-host Anne Wilkie is here.
Hello.
And our guest today is viral content creator, researcher, author of Ken Not Included, and host of Ultramind's podcast, JK Ultra, or Jenn Carmody. Welcome.
Hello. I'm so glad to be here. And I'm so excited you guys both have the book.
Yes. We've been reading on it. Mine is well thumbed and notes and just so many great stories in your book. I loved it.
Thank you.
I have to agree. I got it and couldn't put it down. And my favorite parts were when you were sharing your own stories in amongst all the other information and thoughts that you had. What prompted you to write it, and how easy or how difficult was it to actually get the flow of this book going?
So this book was such a saga. So it was over 10 years ago. It was right before my 25th birthday that I got this idea where I'm like, oh my God, I am going to write the guide for modern women. The world was also very different 12 years ago when I got that idea, which was, this was pre-Me Too. A lot of these things that are in the book might be kind of more commonly discussed now. But at that time, I was like, oh my God, this has never been done. And I was like, this is going to be New York Times bestseller by next year. And so, my Leo self, of course, thinking that I'm like, that's it. I'm going to sell 1 million copies 365 days from right now. And so the process was very strenuous because I would have this really crazy burst of energy. I think the first time that I sat down to write it, I did 30 days straight, and I basically wrote almost 100,000 words, which is way longer than this book is now. And then I kind of couldn't look at it again. A year later, did another burst, and then 2 years later did another burst, and I would keep going back and re-editing it and moving things around, taking things out, adding new things. And what's crazy is, the 10 years that it took me to write it, I had to grow, evolve a lot in myself. The book's tone was a little bit more harsh in the beginning, and it kind of softened over those years. And then the other thing was I really had this idea of I do not want to self-publish. I want a publisher. I want to be in bookstores. I want to be on bestsellers list. And about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I did get a book deal with a publisher, with a big independent publisher. And I had an agent, and I was like, okay, this is it. Because I could have probably self-published it many times before that. But I was like, no, this needs to happen in this way. And then as I was in that contract, I just felt you know what? They don't get it. The editor is not doing their job. I'm like, and then the whole point of the book is really writing your own story and creating your own path. And I'm doing the most archaic, old school way and trying to follow this path that has already been. So actually 6 months before the book was supposed to come out, I got out of the contract and then quickly had to edit it myself and find an editor and do all of this myself then, because the editor was just she wasn't seeing the vision. And I was like, you know what? These are my personal stories. Why am I going to give all the rights away for people that don't even appreciate it? And probably just, gave me the deal because I had a lot of followers on TikTok. And I'm like, they don't even care about this book. So then I was in a little bit of a race and also realized a lot of those things were ego stuff outside validation, would be having a publisher. But bestsellers list, that was something that I thought I cared about. In time, I realized that those are just editors' picks, that's not really about the sales. There's all these books that are excellent that have even more sales that never get on the lists because it's an editor's pick. And then I realized, like, kind of with bookstores, there's only so much shelf space. So they oftentimes have to sell them back to the publisher. So it's really kind of a vanity thing as much as it feels good to see your book on a shelf and like walk in. So other friends that I have that have had like traditionally published books recently, they're like, they don't even do the advertising for you. You basically have to do it all yourself. And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna like listen to my own advice. That is what's in the book and do it myself, do it my way. And yeah, it was a long journey. And then I realized I was writing this book for the modern woman. And by the end, after like the 10 to then 12 years, by the point that it actually was done and released, I was like, I think I probably wrote this book for myself.
Hmm. Yeah. What's really interesting, we just had a woman on who Jasmine Safi, our last show, was with a woman who designed and wrote an oracle deck. And so much of her deck was also writing. And while she was talking, I kind of thought of this issue, and you brought this up again. She also self-published her oracle cards.
Mhm.
And I feel like that is the way to go these days, definitely, as you point out. But she talked about the creative process. And at the beginning of what you said, you also talked about your own creative process and how you thought it would be done in 365 days. You just crank it out and all of that. But here's what I always think of, and I think it goes along with the topic in your book, because this kind of comes from when studying women's history myself, right? Or looking at gender in a higher education setting. A lot of times you learn about Virginia Woolf, and she wrote this book, A Room of One's Own, and she writes in there about the difficulty of writing and the creative process for a woman, because women are often slated with multitasking. You in your book even talk about women's brains and how different parts of it light up for different things. We're really good at multitasking because we're slated into that, or it's biological, whatever it is. So I'm just curious about what you think of that, because a lot of times, and I found myself too, working on academic writing, when you're a mom and you've got small children and you're multitasking and doing all these things, that creative process of wanting to sit there, like be in the attic and just be the crazy woman writing and writing, is not something we always get to do. And it's not convenient in the modern world to just sit in an attic and write. So how did you then go from that initial spark to carrying it through 10 years and doing 12,000 probably rewrites and all of that? How do you sustain the creative spirit through all of it?
So I love that you bring up that women kind of have a different creative process because women are cyclical. So it is interesting because, men have the same hormones every day. They wake up and they go through the same. So for men to have the same task every day works really well for them, actually. And then obviously, women, we have a different hormonal cycle of 28 days. So we kind of have 1.5 really good, like, time out of the week for us to be in one of those states, and then we're in another state, and then we're in another state. So that's really interesting because you're right, like a lot of this kind of mad writer thing is often men going through this process and locking themselves in a room, oftentimes while they have like their spouse being able to bring them food and being able to make sure that they have their needs met. A lot of times when we hear about like Stephen King or other people like that writing process. So as far as kind of sustaining it for all that time was I also couldn't get it out of my head. So like, you have these things where it's like, you have to do it. And then being able to do it and finish it is so difficult. But then it's also like almost harder to not do it and to be honest, this book really, as I love it, but I'm also so glad that the chapter is done and the book is closed because it at times almost like a weird shadow that was following me everywhere because I had been telling people for so long, like, I'm writing this book, and then the book's just never coming out and never being finished. But it really taught me a lot about divine timing because what I thought I wanted. My ego wanted it to be at this time. Then like my energy levels wanted it to be at this time. And then I was aging, and then also other things were happening in the world. Me Too happened, and different things were happening in so many different ways. The Barbie movie came out, and all of these things. I'm like, oh my God, like this, my ego is like, I wanted to be before this, or I wanted to be during this. But little did I know that, the time that I came up with this idea to the completion and having it published, I didn't know that I was going to be posting online or have an audience. So I, at that time, as much as my ego wanted it to be done, the divine timing of it was like, okay, it's going to be done when there's actually people to read it, when there's actually people to buy it. So I think that that's another thing, I feel like I kind of like, I don't know, just like made up this term of like divine procrastination. Sometimes we're procrastinating because the way or the people that it's for, or whoever the audience is or the reader is or whatever it is not available to you yet. So it made me kind of release any stress around all creative projects, because we have that thing that we're dreaming of doing. We all have them. And then it's like, oh, I just haven't done it yet. And I still want to make that thing. I still want to do that. And now I just trust it, because I was like, for 10 years, I beat myself up all the time for not being consistent with working on the book. And it turned out better and had a better way that I could share it, and it had people that like already trusted me and wanted to hear about my personal stories. So I really do think that like if we're procrastinating on something, that there very often could be some bigger reason that is catching up to you that we don't even know about.
Okay, so I've got about 5 things I want to say. First of all, I know you're happy that the chapter is closed. I feel like you might have another book in you, and I'm going to tell you why. The snippets that you share about your life are so interesting and so well written, and you add to that the ability to self-reflect and talk about your own shortcomings and the experiences that you've had and the relationship with the director and all of those sorts of things, I think is so incredibly powerful, saying the things that we're not necessarily meant to say. And I'm thinking of all of those stories mixed with your younger life that you've talked about on your podcast and with us and on other podcasts when you've been a guest on other shows. And I think for you to sit down and put that into a book, it would be phenomenal. And maybe it's not now, maybe it's not for another 10 or 20 years, but I would be so happy to read that, because I just love the way you tell stories. As for the self-publishing thing, I said this to Jasmine about her deck, because I use her deck quite a lot when I do the Oracle card readings. The finish on those cards is my favorite of any deck I have ever used. The gold embossed on the border of it, the hand feel, the finish of the cards. And I have so many cards from so many different publishing houses. And I think about the finish and how quickly some of them essentially start to disintegrate and get really worn. And there's a beauty to a really worn deck of cards, whether it be tarot, oracle, or whatever that you're using. But to have this gorgeous finish on the cards where they always feel amazing in your hand means something. And I think self-publishing a book, while I haven't gone through the process of it, to be working with people that don't see your vision, where editors are going to change things and take things out which you know are important and that needs to be out in the world, it's to take control of that and do it yourself, I think is an incredibly important thing. And I think the world is shifting, where we used to, I think about when I modeled and how modeling agencies used to be versus how they are now. Now everything is based on how many followers do you have. And a lot of agents won't work hard at getting you work. They'll sign you and wait for you to bring them the opportunities that you're curating for yourself. And I think that publishing and even music is going the same way. So to take your power back is a huge thing. Did you learn a lot about yourself when you were going through that process and taking the decision to self-publish back and get out of that contract?
Yeah, and really what I learned about myself was, obviously, we all find ourselves to be authentic people and are trying our best to be authentic at all times, or just it comes naturally. But there's still always more layers coming off of like things that are these weird masks or things that we're wearing. So, like, with that, the biggest thing I learned about myself was like, as much as I'm kind of like, oh, screw the system, type of person, I still was wanting the validation from it. And that was something that I had to admit to myself in that process. So I think the thing that I learned, about myself with the self-publishing was really like, why did I want that so bad? Why did I want that validation from people who weren't going to get it anyway? Or like, why did I want validation from a bookstore or from a list or from all of these things outside of myself? So as much as like I would have self-awareness or be someone who thinks outside of the box, still to be living with those things of wanting some type of validation as much as I don't see myself that way. And then also too the reflection of kind of the personal stories, which a lot of that stuff had been written so long ago for the book because a lot of those personal stories were written many years ago. I kind of, as I went through this last edit, which I did hire my own editor, and she did a really good job to make it more clear of kind of everything, because she had better grammar and she did a good job of keeping everything intact. And still, I'm sure it was a lot of work for her to also fix what she did. And but it really was interesting because looking back at my own personal stories, they feel so distant. So, like, turning them into art, turning them into even just writing them down, it really makes it feel so separate from you that, like, everything in that book, it's kind of like, oh my God, it's almost like a movie I watched rather than it was actually my life at this point, which is, one, a testament to how far I've come and changed and grown as a person. But then also, um, I appreciate what you said about kind of like the parts of it, like our own shortcomings. And that's something that I think was a little bit hard for my editor to understand. And that was what some of her notes were about, was kind of like, well, I make a lot of bad decisions too. And I also talk about, my relationship with this director of how, yeah, then I stayed with him to keep my job. And, like it kind of goes against a bit of this narrative, which is connected to Me Too, about like it is completely a power imbalance. And there was absolutely power imbalance. And it absolutely was some of those things. But also, it would be dishonest for me to take out the part that I played in it and the part that I did decide to keep going along with things because I wanted that work, because I wanted that job, because I wanted the paycheck. And so, that I think was a bit difficult for my editor. Some of her notes at some of those points were like, well, kind of, should anyone listen to you then? Like, who wants your advice on this topic then if you have, and I'm like, but this is honest. And that's why later in the book, when I kind of address from the 10-year mark towards like the last chapters, I'm kind of like, yeah, there's points that you might think I'm contradicting myself. You might think, why didn't you do this? And it's like, but this is the honest story of what happened. Like, there is, and I think that that's kind of the thing that needs to be brought back into some of the things around women is the nuance, that it's not only overpowering and victimhood, and that these things, are many layers and many nuance. And yeah, so I appreciate that you brought up those things about like the self-reflection in that.
Mm-hmm.
Just before,
sorry.
I wanted to just make a comment and then you can go ahead and ask your question. I think the whole thing is we've gotten into this thought pattern of we need to be perfect and we need to be making the right decisions the whole way through. The reality is when we're young, we screw up, we make bad decisions. And I'm grateful I grew up going through my late teens, early 20s without social media. Because while there probably is some evidence of some of those bad decisions in terms of photographs that were taken with a camera that had film in it, it's not documented on the internet for the whole world to see, but it doesn't take away from my experiences. With that being said, all the advice that I give, and when people say, "Oh, thank you so much," and how do you know all this? It's because I've screwed up and made so many bad decisions that it's gotten me to this point where I'm able to see what you're doing and maybe guide you away from making the same mistakes. But this is how we learn and make better decisions moving forward. And this is how we show the people that are coming after us. And hopefully they learn from that. And I think to move through life believing you're a victim of somebody else, believing that you played no part in whatever it was going on, is a crazy belief for anybody to have. I'd like to see somebody move through life without making a single mistake and being able to write the story about how wonderful they were. It would be the most boring book you've ever read in your life. That was all. Show for it, Anne.
Well, did you want to say something about that, Jen, before I launch into another thing?
No, I think I absolutely agree with this kind of everyone has to be perfect. This is also the reason why a lot of movies, a lot of stories are not as good as they used to be, because the protagonist has to be like completely a good person. And that's just not anybody. And, I think we are starting to kind of, after this kind of post cancel culture movement right now, that people are starting to be more accepting of nuance, and people make mistakes and people change, and but I think you're right, it does really come from kind of the younger generation growing up on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that one of the things you do at the end of the book would be so useful for anyone also who had put out their lives on the internet their whole lives, right? At the end of the book, you talk about the process of writing being like a soul retrieval. And I loved that. I mean, I had never seen someone talking about, you really tie everything together at the end in that concept of soul retrieval, not only from thinking of sort of how all your stories come together. It's like you're piecing together all the fractures of who you are, but it's also in thinking about the expectations on men and women in a way, and retrieving all of that to be a whole person. So how'd you come up with that theme at the end? Was that just a last minute thing? Were you thinking of that the whole way through?
Thank you so much. It's so honestly, I appreciate you guys so much for acknowledging all of these different aspects of the book, because it does mean a lot to me. And the soul retrieval aspect really came from my editor's notes. So it was kind of a bit of a last minute, and that was not something that she suggested. It was more so her pointing out kind of inconsistencies in me as a person, in this kind of like, well, why should somebody listen to you about this? Or like, it was one of the funny things is because my editor was great. I so appreciate her, but she didn't know anything about my JK Ultra life at all. She just only read the book. So she doesn't know anything about me except what is in the book. Even like a chapter in, she's like, how old are you? You need to say like how old you are to the reader, like, which was great that she knew zero about me in any way. But then, so when we got to the point of the book where we talk about kind of the mind, body, spirit aspect, so like the brain, the hormones, and then the spiritual. So kind of like feminine and masculine brain, feminine and masculine body, and then feminine and masculine energy. When she got to that point, her notes were like, what the hell is this? She's like, no offense, I don't think anyone wants to hear about spirituality and the brain from someone like you who has been writing all of this up to this point, someone who's an ex-dominatrix, someone who's this. And I was like, this is so funny, because I'm like, actually all the rest of the stuff in the book is the stuff I don't usually talk about. I'm like, I actually do talk about the brain and the spirituality. That's what people do expect from me. So it was pretty funny that, kind of her kind of viewing only through the story of the book her notes about these things, about like, do you want to keep this in? It doesn't make you look good. It doesn't make you look maybe smart or trustworthy to say this, or, you know, not picking a stance on something, or, you know, kind of looking like some things are more like feminist liberal. And then after that, looking like maybe this is more conservative. And she was pointing out a lot of the inconsistencies throughout the book, because there's every topic is, you know, multifaceted of being a woman is covered. So that was actually something that I ended up writing in the last, as I had gone through that last edit, and I was adding most of her stuff and then changing some of her edits back to the original. I was like, you know, like this really is like a soul retrieval that I'm doing with this book. So then it just was like that very last little icing that came in. So I'm really glad that she was honest with me about what was coming up for her, because that allowed me to kind of see it from someone else's perspective. And it also gave me the idea of like, maybe I should explain in flat out words that we're all multifaceted and that we all have many different parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that's, even though there are so many messages in the book, I think that's one of the most important ones, because we are multifaceted and we are living in this world at the moment where everything is, it's this side or that side. You've got to agree with me, and I said this before, or you don't. But it's this weird space where you are meant to be this single thing, and it's just not the reality. And as I was reading different parts of it, I kept thinking, because there were moments where I'm like, this is very different to the Jenn that I know. And the woman that I watched for years online talking, the woman that I've gotten to know over the last sort of 8 months, I think was the first time we actually spoke in person. And then I'd keep reading, and I'm like, oh, there she is. And it made me reflect on who I am, and that I think I'm a contradiction just as much as you are, because I don't have one single political belief, and I don't sit with that like one political party and go, it's you all the way. We were talking before we went live about Candace Owen, and I agree with a lot of what she says and I enjoy her work. Then there is so much that I disagree with, and I still enjoy her even when I don't agree with her and I think she's a bit crazy. And I think it's reminding people that you're allowed to be this way.
And I think, you know, that also gives permission to other people to kind of be multifaceted. And, you know, one of the things that I try to be really mindful of is a lot of people that I've watched and loved their work, they kind of become a character of themselves and they start playing themselves over time. And people who I really love their stuff, but I start to not resonate over time, because I'm like, you know, it's like they're playing the character of this person and not being themselves anymore. And then the other side of it is like, you know, all of us have had this experience with, like, say, musicians where they're like, oh, they changed. Their old stuff was so good. And like they are growing. So like musicians are a great example of like how people are a bit punished for growing or changing in their art. And now that people kind of are the product, or they are the face of it and their opinions, people like pigeonhole themselves into things that behind the scenes they don't even really believe in anymore, but they still have to pay the bills. They still have to talk about the same thing. And, you know, so it's something I try to be really mindful of, because there's people who maybe 5 years ago I really liked their content. And I'm like, they're still talking about reptilians and 5D. I mean,
Yeah.
come on, how many different ways can you say the same thing? And so, and I don't wanna be that, you know, because I've just observed it so much that it's like, I'm gonna evolve, and, you know, that means some people are gonna get off the stream, you know? They're gonna be like, "You know
Mhm.
what? I don't resonate anymore. I still wanna listen to those old things about ascension or this or that," you know? So, I think it's important to me to, like, stay authentic and to actually reveal more of myself,
Mhm.
because I think that, you know, I get less feedback on personal stuff, but it's more meaningful feedback. So like when I do share my personal stories, whether it's ayahuasca or the personal stories in the book, that's the most meaningful feedback. When I kind of do content that is more like general spirituality stuff, it gets more comments, more views, but less depth in those comments and views. So I really have kind of been moving more towards thinking that like our own personal stories are the medicine because we already know all the stuff. How many different ways can we talk about every spiritual concept that's been talked about in every single way that could be, you know?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. I love that you, well, first of all, I love that you haven't pigeonholed yourself. That is something that you see so much, people really getting stuck into doing the one thing that they think everybody wants to see, but then the algorithm rewards that, so they continue to go. But you have jumped into all these new areas, and in your book, I love that you suddenly spring up this information, and I'm like, what? So that's what I want to talk about now, is all these interesting parts in the book. Like, here are my two things I was dying to know more about. Of course, the dominatrix phase. When I read that part, I was like, Natalie, have you read this part yet?
I hadn't gotten there yet.
And it just happened that the book was down and I just opened it, and that was the chapter that opened up. So I was like, I'll just read this. It was like between all of my many other things I'm doing. And I start reading, I'm like, oh, this is such a good part. So that part, and we can come back to that. And the whole Michael thing, the whole virgin, pure woman thing. I don't know why I thought that was so interesting as well. But to go from that to the dominatrix chapter, it's just so funny. And that's the thought of you yelling at this drunken guy who's, we should probably tell the story first, but he's so distraught over the fact that you might not be pure, that you might be a slut. And how kind you were in the moment, because I don't think I could have been like that. But anyway.
Well, you know, I loved him a lot at the time, so that definitely helped me to be nice to him. But you know, so kind of it comes up in a part of the book, which I believe it's in the chapter called Lolita and the Prince, and it's about this kind of Lolita complex, which, you know, a little bit of a play on the Prince Charming, but a little bit of play on Prince Andrew because of this whole teenage girl thing. And, you know, one of the things that I discuss in that chapter on the bigger topic is kind of how a lot of people who are so invested in these Epstein files are the same podcasters that are talking about, oh, a woman in her 30s is used up. You need a virgin, a body count. And it's like, oh, okay, so you're no different than Epstein and Prince Andrew and all of those people who went and got teenage virginal girls from these guys. So you just, don't like it that really wealthy people did it, but it's okay when all these podcast bros say the same thing, basically. So kind of the hypocrisy of this like obsession with purity, and how in this world you need experience, right? In this man's world, you can't get a job without experience, but you can't get the experience without the job. But in this one area, if you have experience, it's the worst thing ever. It makes you less than. And so this kind of contradiction around it, and it came through also talking about in my personal story. One of my exes who he was from another country, and so he had some different values. And when we were talking about, like, he would get really triggered if I had ever mentioned that I had like ever slept with anybody before him. And I was also like 28 years old at that time. So like obviously I had. And so, but he would get really upset because it was like impacting his manhood. And he's like, well, you know, in my culture, I shouldn't even marry a woman who's been with other men because this makes me not a man. And I'm like, okay, first of all, we're not getting married. But second of all, what does it matter? I'm like, he was literally sleeping with people probably the day before he met me. So, and
while he was seeing you too, right?
Right. Then exactly. Then I also found that out as well, because of course that's always the case. I had I don't know to what degree. I'm pretty sure because there was some parts of that I took out of the story, but I'm pretty sure I did also tell how our breakup happened. But so basically, kind of had this discussion with him, and I just wanted to just say like, oh, I didn't really want to talk about the dominatrix time of my life with him because I knew how sensitive he was to the fact of like other men. So then I was just like, oh yeah, that was like, I don't know, the slutty time of my life, whatever. And then he started to spiral. So he was like, held it together barely that day. The next day, he got so drunk to the point that he could barely walk. He's stumbling around and he's like, please tell me you weren't a slut. I can't love you if you were. And he's like losing it, crying on the floor when he's the slut, really, actually. And so this like obsession with purity, and then also too, this kind of, which I talk about earlier in the book, is really also this like obsession like with not aging, that women, it's ingrained in so many aspects of our culture that it's also like bad to age. And it's like, then I also get into the Lolita stuff because this was, a like American classic book and film where, of course, yeah, there is some like social commentary happening in the book, but also it's very directly pornographic for what it is. So there's that. And then around the Dom chapters of the book, that was something that was not in the original versions of the book because I never would tell anybody about that time in my life because I was so afraid that people were going to use it against me in some way or another. And now it's just so far long ago that it's like, oh my God, like, and the world has changed a lot. People like Julia Fox coming out as like being a dominatrix. And like now it's just so normal. Like people just have OnlyFans and all of these things. The world has changed a lot from I did that when I was 18 years old. So it was like almost 20 years ago that I had done that era of my life. So 20 years ago, it was still very taboo. And it was different because it wasn't this online world in the same way. It was like, this was the real dungeon stuff. This was the old school BDSM world. And, so that like, there's so many stories. I could write a whole entire book just on that chapter. Like there's the one that I pick was really just around, toxic and feminine masculinity and roles reversal stuff. But there is so much that I can say about that chapter of my life. And I really I just recently kind of came out about that with also on my own podcast with my ex-boyfriend, who's the comedian Jim Norton, who was actually my client. And then we started dating from there. And he actually kind of pushed me to quit that world and then to go to film school and like pursue my dreams, which is then what led me to coming to LA. But it was fun to like kind of reveal more in the podcast around kind of that chapter of my life. And, my infamous ex-boyfriend, Jim, who we always like are super close still, to be like now people to realize like, oh, wait, that dominatrix that he's been telling jokes about for 13 years is Jenn. This is crazy.
How, as an 18-year-old, did you learn what you needed to do? And I asked this because back when I was modeling, there was a guy that would email a lot of the girls in the industry. It was dominatrix-esque things done to him. And I think at the time he offered me up to $1,000 to spend an hour with him, and there was no sexual contact in terms of there wasn't going to be, I wouldn't have to perform anything other than these tasks that he talked about. A whole lot of girls judged him and blocked him and did all of this. I just didn't respond because I didn't have an interest in pursuing that with him. Another girlfriend of mine called me and she said, this man's just reached out to me. This is what he's offered me. Will you come with me? And I said, I will go to the venue with you and make sure you're safe, but I'm not coming in. I don't want to do it. And she goes, okay. So she started a working relationship with this man. And sometimes it was just her. Sometimes there were groups of girls that would go in and essentially humiliate this man. And people would say to me, "You'd be a great dominatrix." And I went, "I probably would, but I wouldn't know how to get started so that I was doing it effectively." And you're talking about doing it at the age of 18. How does an 18-year-old learn what to do? Or is this just a part of you that exists and you know what to tap into?
What a good question. So, I had at that time, if you guys have ever seen photos of me from when I was younger, I don't post them that much, but like I was very like I was kind of already dressing like that because I was very into like the cyber goth stuff and things. So I was kind of dressing in like the fetish clothes for day-to-day life. So I already was very kind of in the style of it. And then I was very hardcore. Like I'm so like I've gotten progressively nicer and more pure. I was like a very like extreme bad rotten teenager. Like so was extreme. And I also I know it's all the craze now, but I was a man hater back then. So it was like very natural to like want to take out this aggression on men. And also the hardest part was really learning to maintain your own power during because you do have these people who are genuine submissives and those genuine submissives are very easy, nice clients usually. But then you have those people who are topping from the bottom, they call it. So these are the people who are almost part of their like kink is like coercing the professional to push her boundaries. And so almost like in this weird way, asking for what they want in a way that kind of pushes the dominatrix's boundaries. And that is the thing that is more you learn in the moment. Thankfully, I'm like a strong-minded person, but I definitely had things that were scary or inappropriate happen that then made me be like, okay, now I need this other like kind of method to be like 10 steps ahead. And it's a mental game. So it does like require you to be smart to be able to like outsmart some of these people. And then also I was working in a dungeon. So this because it was that old school BDSM world, there was a headmistress and she did us the training. So, they taught us how to tie the ropes. They taught us all of the flogging, the whipping, the this, the that, what all the different fetishes are, the different types of men. And then I had worked at another dungeon after that was like even more advanced because the guys who owned it were they're pretty maniacal. So the guys who owned it had really advanced knowledge on mind control stuff, which is crazy that I ended up being into all the MK Ultra stuff because the mind control stuff that they had taught us, they would have people come in and teach us like hypnofetish, which is also funny because now I do, fetish. I mean, now I do the healing for hypnosis, but before I actually learned how to do it when I was 18 for like hypnofetish, which is this fantasy that like you can hypnotize someone into doing something they didn't want to do. Now, of course, you actually can't. It is like something that they kind of convince themselves is happening. And most people actually are more attracted to the induction. Like, say, sometimes you would do something like that on the phone because they were afraid to do it in person because they kind of want to be maybe hypnotized to do something that then you can blackmail them with that they didn't have recollection of doing. It's like some very deep fantasy that, wherever that fantasy is originated, I'll never know. But then sometimes these people would want to call because they were afraid that you might actually get them to do something that they didn't want to do. And then once you get down to like, okay, 1, now you counted them down to 10. You hit 1 and they're like, click, goodbye, because they're just like into the induction part. So we did have different ways that we learned things. Like, so a lot of the stuff, so I was grateful that I did work in dungeons because it allowed me to actually learn how to do the things safely. Because definitely a lot of the people who I later after that became independent pretty quickly and then just started like doing my own thing. But I learned a lot of those like safety and things. And also I was 18, so I also wasn't safe. Like I also wasn't like, I also was definitely, pushing people's boundaries further than what it should have been, because I was a teenager and teenagers don't even understand consequences yet. So, as much as, I see stuff like some other people that I've known that have been doms, they're very like careful about safety. I was like, I was a reckless teenage menace. And that's why I was so good at it. And that's why I made so much money doing it because I was ruthless.
So you were a different type of teenager for this elite sect of men. I don't know, Prince Andrew would have been afraid of you probably.
Right. Yeah, no, it was a lot of like Wall Street accountants. I didn't know anything about politics, anything. So who knows? I could have seen people that were anybody, like I wouldn't have known who anybody was because I really just didn't have any awareness. So it could have very well been. I mean, it's obviously a very expensive hobby to have. So typically the type of people who do it do have a lot of money and are probably very well connected, but I didn't know this person from that person. I wouldn't. And honestly, I can barely remember anyone. They kind of all look the same, just like old white guys.
It's all right. You just put a gag in their mouth and you don't need to listen to them.
It's foggy.
Just another day at the office. But I mean, so much about that life, I'm sure in any context, you could use it as a metaphor for things going on in any office, right? At least these are people who are getting it all of that shadow side, they're playing it out. And who knows, right? It's maybe making them be able to do the rest of their lives. And
right.
Yeah. Sorry.
It is a safer way than the way a lot of people, because then now after Me Too, consent is a big topic. But in that world, which is, the underbelly, that was always the topic. The topic has always been consent in that world and has always been around, having permission, safe words, checking in. So it's interesting that a lot of the kind of underbelly stuff is more advanced than some of the stuff that was in the regular vanilla world.
Yeah. I'm pausing because I figure Natalie will have a question about this. So
No, I actually don't.
No.
No, I thoroughly enjoy this whole conversation, and every part of me could sit here for the rest of the show and just be like, tell us all the stories. But,
well, there's one thing that I keep thinking of as we're talking about this, since Prince Andrew came up, and when does he not come up these days? But and the whole purity thing, right? I don't think we talked about it. I think this was on our show with Amanda Ellis, maybe Natalie. And maybe we didn't talk about this aspect, but we did talk about Princess Diana during that. And I just remember as a child getting ready to watch the Princess Diana wedding with Prince Charles. Before that whole thing in the buildup, it was all about, is she a virgin? I remember that whole discussion. Maybe Natalie, would you remember that? Were you
I
young
actually
at that point?
do, and I have very fixed memories about the whole royal wedding thing, even with Fergie. And I remember there was a scandalous photo of Di because she was a preschool teacher. And so they got a photo of her with a child on her hip, and I think she's holding the hand of another one, and she's got a skirt and a blouse on, and the skirt is sort of mid-calf length, but they've taken the photo and the light is shining behind her, and so you can see the outline of her legs. And that was just scandalous. How could she not wear a slip?
I know.
Touch the pearls. And I remember all of this, and then that horrific dress, which I think at the time I thought was just beautiful. And one of my sisters actually had books that were printed from both the royal weddings, Diana and Fergie. But yeah, it was all about the purity and living up to those standards.
Yeah.
Right. It's so crazy, this virgin obsession. Like, people, I hope, like, now as we're like progressing as like society, really see how demented that is. Like, it's still so ingrained in, and it's kind of has a revival right now with this kind of red pill podcast bro movement. And it's just so extreme, kind of the differences. You know, you have like the Andrew Tate type of people who can literally openly say he has 50 girlfriends that he pimps out and that he makes them do webcam. And they're like, yeah. And then like a woman does like the most minor thing and it still goes back to this weird purity culture. So when I first met my husband, I told him that I used to be a dominatrix, and he didn't really have a reaction to it. But then a couple months later, it had come up and I realized that he kind of didn't know what that meant. So he didn't really know what it meant. So he was like, and then I was like, wait, you thought that I had sex with all those people? Because it was, like you said, like before, how this guy had reached out to you for these kind of different things that you didn't end up doing.
Yeah.
It is sexual in nature, of course,
Yes.
but it is not
Sexual
it's not
contact.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, it is in nature, obviously, that's what it is, but it's not, that type of it's different than other types of work in that field. And it was like, so like, I was like, oh my God, Savannah, he's a good man, that he thought that I would like took to those people. And it was like, it made no difference to him. He's like, well, I'm marrying you today. So then I was like,
Aw,
oh, so
that's so
that's
nice.
so pure.
Yeah.
I'm like, even if that was the case, he was still loving me and comfortable with it. And that's how it should be. Like, whatever happened in our lives before meeting that person, which then kind of comes back to the story in my book about that other person in my ex from my past being so upset that I had been with other people before him, even though he had been with other people probably while he was still with me. And it's so interesting, this purity culture, how we're still there. And then it's also weird because then the like OnlyFans stuff is so prominent. And it's just these very extremes that are here where it's like, okay, they're obsessed about women's body count, but then the most successful women in the world right now all are in that field. Either, Kim Kardashian, obviously she's built so much for herself and come so far, but originating from a sex tape. And then you have like now all of these women are making like $8-10 million a year on these platforms. And it's just this very, there's something in Conversations with God about it, even though, that book's from like 1994. But they talk about how the things that we see of true value, like spiritual knowledge, which is like your highest wisdom, and even higher education, higher knowledge and wisdom are the most valuable things. And we think they should be free. But then we have things like that. And in that book, they give the example of exotic dancers. And they're like, but then people throw their money at this. So these things, we have the teachers barely making enough to survive. And then we now see the teachers are leaving to go do that type of work. And then one of the things that I also talk about in those chapters around the purity is like this kind of thing of like girls thinking that they need to do that right at 18 years old. And I very much understand that because that's how I ended up doing it at 18 years old, because that was the only way that I was going to get by. So I see now, and I was very much, rebellious in the underbelly and the outskirts of things. But now it's so mainstream that it's like girls are right when they're 18 thinking like, oh, I should do this. And yeah, maybe they'll get lucky and make millions of dollars and might not get traumatized by it. But most likely, most people who do it, it's so saturated, they're not making that type of money. And then they're just kind of in some ways like traumatizing themselves. And I think that too, we've kind of gone a little too far in the other direction to like not really look out for these teenage girls, that it's like, this is not your first option. It used to be more of a desperation, and now it's less desperation and just kind of becoming more normal to take that path.
Mhm.
I think what has contributed to this is social media, in terms of Bonnie Blue being, all the newspapers report on her and people see the money she's making, and more than anything, the headlines. Because, so this kind of covers a couple of different areas. When I was still living in Australia, I was an ambassador for Bully Zero Australia. I had a tough time when I was at school. I wouldn't tell anyone when I was modeling. And if anybody found a catalog that I was in or a newspaper article, they would bring it to school and carry on about it. And then people would say, she's so stuck up, look at what she's doing. And I haven't told anybody anything about my life, but they've seen something that I've done. And so I was bullied in high school, and then I did The Bachelor season 1 Australia, and the online bullying was just something else. And I learned after the 3rd week to stop reading it, because I was torturing myself. And I realized there was what I had a rule. I said to somebody, you can come and watch it at my house, but there's no social media. I don't want to hear what's being said. I don't want it talked about. And this one girl came around, she was on the show as well, and she said, oh, you don't want to go on Twitter. So of course, when everybody left, what did I do? I went straight to Twitter. And I didn't even have an account at the time. And I'm reading it, and there was this one thread that I read until 5 a.m. And I was beside myself. And what I realized was there was one woman who was the instigator in all of this stuff. And I realized that for over 8 hours of her life, she was just posting hate content about me. And I realized that said more about her than me. But going through that, I went through a very dark period of time. I had to sort of build myself back up. And I met the CEO of Bully Zero at the time, and he said, would you be an ambassador? I said, yes. And then I started getting all these requests from schools to go out and speak to the kids. And I loved doing it. I got no payment or anything for it. It was just something I was asked to do, and I was happy to do it. I felt very fortunate that I was in a position to do it. And I would go and I would tell my stories, and the kids were always amazing, silent as I sort of told my story. And my favorite part was afterwards, they would come up and speak to me. Sometimes they would tell me that they realized while I was speaking that they were the bully and they needed to go apologize to people. Other girls or boys would share their stories of being bullied. And I appreciated that I could give them a hug and tell them it would be okay, and sort of talk about all of that. But what I found overwhelmingly was a topic of discussion was people saying, I want to be on a reality TV show. And I'd say, okay. And I'd say, what do you want to do? Because I never intended to be on this show. It kind of happened. It wasn't my goal in life. And they would say, I want to be an influencer, or I want to be like Kim Kardashian. I'd say, okay, but what do you want to be famous for? And they just said, I just want to be famous. And so you cut to the stories about the OnlyFans girls making huge amounts of money. You go to TikTok, and there are girls that never thought about doing OnlyFans, but they got a huge following on TikTok for just posting about their day or some silly little thing or doing the dances. And so then people go, you should move to OnlyFans, you'll make money. And because they had this base of millions of followers, they would make a ton of money. And then they talk about that. And then you get the Bonnie Blues of the world that are doing what they're doing. And so these girls absolutely see it as a way to be famous. This is how I'm going to make my mark. And because the stigma has been removed in a lot of ways, it's seen as being acceptable. The issue is, I don't think people talk enough about the dark side of it, that a lot of these influencers, and there was a story that made the papers a few months ago about a girl going to Dubai, and apparently these parties happen all the time. These billionaires fly these girls out, and this girl ended up being found unconscious, naked, beaten to a pulp on a sidewalk somewhere in Dubai, of all places, which is not the most female-friendly country. And this is where it's pushing young girls to go, and they don't see it. And this goes back to, we all make mistakes and bad decisions, and we have to be able to come back from it. But that's what I see when I see these girls all trying to move into it. Whereas a dominatrix thing to me is much, much, much safer, because you don't have to give your body. You don't have to be in that space where it can become traumatic.
Right. And a lot of the people who are engaging in it are submissive to women. So they don't want to. There is those kind of topping from the bottom people who are more coercive, but that's, not the typical person who comes through. A lot of the people who come through are, see women as superior to them. So it does put you in a safer position. And, it's such a nuanced thing, because on one side, we want these women who are doing this type of work to be treated as human like everybody else, and, to be seen that they're worthy of safety, that they're worthy of love, that they're, worthy of, because this is kind of the other thing too, is sometimes if it's like a woman is promiscuous, it's almost like if anything bad happens to her, like that girl in Dubai, a lot of people are making it seem like, oh, like she deserves it or things like that. And that's the conversation that needed to change around those types of things, that, even if a woman is doing something like that for money and going to Dubai, she still doesn't deserve anything like that to happen to her. But then it has kind of gone so far that it becomes like kind of, oh, this is, a ticket to success. This is a ticket to fame, to a lot of money. And I think, because the acceptance around it, because we want to protect women who are doing this, at the same time, it makes it almost like the other side of it doesn't get talked about, which is, it is very damaging to the identity and to the self more than anything, because even with what I had been doing, you make up a fake character, and that character starts to become more popular, more loved, more liked, more friends than the real person, and you start to kind of fragment, which is what happens with influencers. And I think that's why I'm very mindful to not be a character, because I already had the dark side of that when I was younger. Whereas I see a lot of people that I know who also do social media, who they really lean into the character, and I see how seductive it is and how easy it is to kind of play a character, and then that character becomes so well loved and so much attention. And I was very successful as a dom. So then to leave that and go to make like what I was making in 1 hour, making that in 1 week, 2 weeks of work, one paycheck was the amount of what I was making in 1 hour. So it was very difficult to kind of stay on course of like, that is not me. I'm going to be Jenn, not this other character. And as long as this takes to build is what I'm going to like commit to. And I'm going to commit to myself to build, me as Jennifer Carmody and not me as this other character. And that's where, I think it doesn't get talked about enough, because it's kind of a new thing, like before it was only celebrities. Now it's available to everybody.
Right. Yeah. I remember when all of these, I don't even remember. So we went from the Kardashians, right? And they were influencers, and so many people are following this show that's on TV, to people becoming like that. I just remember as a professor seeing students go from that to all of a sudden you hear that they do have their own. It was YouTube always at first, right? And they're making way more than I was doing things on YouTube. And I remember always thinking, well, who is managing their careers? Because at the same time, you think of how much was, I mean, like all the other stories coming out about things happening to just young men and women, right? In Hollywood. And I guess it's worse there, right? I don't know, but you think about people needing some advice, and you can just see some of them kind of have crises about really who are they. And I think that nothing about our society prepares people for fame, actually. And relatively, like, this is a recent thing in history that we could be sitting here even and contact people all around the world. So if you have a TikTok that blows up and all these people are seeing you, it seems like it'd be really difficult to stay grounded, and in your authentic voice. We talked about that, but the more that we're talking about it, I'm just realizing, yeah, it is a new phenomenon. This is brand new.
You know, Dr. Amen, who's the brain specialist, he talked about in some of his brain scans that what he sees in the brains of famous people is that the temporal lobes are kind of like shot. Like they kind of can't be lit up anymore. So like once someone reaches like an extreme fame, that excitement that would light up the temporal lobe is just done. And then, you know, the thing that makes me think is after hearing some of his talks about that, now, of course, then that becomes dopamine chasing, that becomes addiction, that becomes gambling, that becomes all of these things that we see happening to celebrities because that part of the brain, it's already like blown out, you know, the screw has been stripped. There's nothing to excite it anymore. So then me and my conspiracy, you know, mind think like, damn, well, this is also why we hear a lot of super wealthy, super famous, super like untouchable type of people possibly doing very demented things. And it's like when we see that their brain is so like, and this makes sense too, even on like the level of say like gambling, you know, like that's why they have to gamble so much higher. And then money doesn't work. They have to gamble their life. Now they have to gamble getting caught something, gamble potentially going to jail. And it's like the stakes need to be raised so much to get any type of dopamine hit or to get these kind of normal functions that the average person has in normal settings. So it is interesting. Like, you know, I think Dr. Amen is probably one of the only people who I've seen who has like been able to like study what it really does to the brain because he's done a lot of celebrity brain scans. And we're going to see in the future, you know, now that was with like, you know, the Justin Bieber people that he did it on. Now it's like this is happening to regular people who just have internet access.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like essentially what happens with drug addicts because they can't produce dopamine, all of that. And a friend's husband was having major drug addiction issues, and ultimately he never got off them. He's completely destroyed his life. But apparently the reason with drug addiction, especially with ice, which I think is the equivalent of crack cocaine, it could be, I could be wrong saying that they're the equivalent. I don't know a lot about drugs, so I can't speak to it, but they can't produce dopamine and a couple of other things in their brain for at least 9 or 18 months. And so this is why it's so hard for them to stay sober, because they get sober and they never feel joy. They never feel happiness. They never feel those things that we feel day to day and when good things are happening. And so because they can't feel that, they hit a certain point where they go, this is pointless. And they go out to get the hit of the thing that is going to make them feel sort of that joy as much as they can. And that's what it sounds like fame is essentially doing.
Right. And if it was just numbness, that would probably be fine. But then it just sucks that they're not able to feel the dopamine, the serotonin, the oxytocin. So it's like the good stuff is what they're then kind of not able to feel. But then they're still able to feel, unfortunately, the depression, the traumas, the anxiety that has led them to start using some type of substance. So that's what's so also tragic about it is it doesn't completely numb everything. It just really prevents those feel-good hormones from or neuroreceptors from getting triggered.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, in your book, you talk so much about how women, I mean, you focus on women, but this happens to men as well. And you do talk about that as well, right? But we are being programmed to be a part of this culture that's looking for dopamine hits. And we get trapped into this cycle of always having to raise the bar because we're programmed from the time that we have our your baby bop hair thing. I'm sorry. I thought that was funny. You talk about doing art and it's this baby bop hair container, the baby bop from Barney, right? Who is, again, isn't she? It's a girl, right?
Mhm.
And she's a certain type of femininity, but it
Right.
brought out your artistic talent. But while you're drawing that, you are being conditioned too, even in the fact that it's your hair conditioning treatment, right?
Right, right.
And hair is such a big issue too for women. So, as you point out in your book.
Right, there is a lot of focus on hair, and kind of one of the first topics that I talk about is body hair, because it's obviously one of the most natural things, and we're made to be so ashamed of it, to spend so much money managing it, torturing ourselves, and then, I kind of get into the whole Gillette thing and how it was actually originally considered unfeminine to use a razor. And Gillette wanted to maximize their sales. So they came up with this idea. They paired up with Harper's Bazaar and other magazines at the time. And they started to push the narrative that basically you should be smooth, you should be hairless. And they started actually kind of working with fashion brands to kind of promote sleeveless dresses to kind of get the armpit shaving in. And of course, like, anybody can do whatever they want with their hair. But, one of the stories that I talk about in there is how it's gotten so extreme that we even are, like, not even allowed to have ass hair. And I talk about my embarrassing story of going to get laser treatments with this big Russian lady, lasering my butt. Um, and then even too, like, even at the time that the book is already out, I'm still going to a Russian lady for my chin hair electrolysis, which is the update since the book is the just any pointers for anybody out there who want to deal with chin hairs. Um, do not get them lasered, because it creates mutant hairs. It caused more growth, and now I have to get electrolysis.
Oh
So
no.
it's like,
Mutant hairs.
this is the never-ending saga of hair as a woman. Even if I wrote a whole book about it's okay, I mean, I can't walk around with my chin hairs. It still affects me.
Well, I have to say, when I read that chapter, I laughed so hard. And the reason I laughed was, one, how you tell the story, two, that was your experience. And the reason I laugh at that being your experience, I never liked hair on my body. And I can't point to any one thing. It was just I didn't like it. That was it. And so I always waxed. I never used a razor, but I have been lasered top to tail. Everything's great, except my experience was so different from yours. It was so different. I had such a great relationship with my woman, and she was good. We had it down to a fine art. And it was just, for me, it was so easy and so simple. And I'm reading about your experience. I'm like, no wonder she's like, this is bullshit. I would do the same thing. But it was interesting to me that two women can have just completely different experiences with exactly the same thing.
Right, right, how everything is individual. There's a lot of things that comes up too, like, maybe not as much in the book, but there's definitely things that sometimes I'll bring up. Like, say, for example, stuff between men and women. And then people will be like, well, that's not my experience with men at all. Actually, it was women who did this to me. So it's very interesting how every individual person, there's, of course, these kind of social programming that we all consumed and in one way or another impacted us, even if it was like, not something that was maybe your favorite thing. We were
Yeah.
still kind of, programmed by it in one way or another. But it is so different how everyone's experience is so unique at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'll say is, for men, there's a lot of programming around hair as well, right? That pattern baldness is not a good thing. And also there's men who just don't have as many whiskers as others, right?
Right.
Or are you going to have a full beard or not? Are you going to groom your beard? It's just, there's just too many people making a lot of money off of hair products and hair removal that it's always going to be a thing at this point.
I have to say, Anne knows that I did this recently. I went to some hot springs up in Northern California, and in this particular place, it's clothing optional, not a problem. So I go up there, but there are a lot of men that do not groom. And look, up there are women that don't groom them like either, which totally fine. Everybody can do their own thing. But it led to a discussion about men who don't groom and how they are often the ones. Everything's wildly out of control. I don't know how else to say this. They expect blowjobs and all the things. And as a woman, nobody wants that whole thing like rammed in your face and your eyes and everywhere else. But they are the ones that often expect their women to be groomed to within an inch of their life. And for me, it's the hypocrisy.
Right.
If you don't want to groom, that's fine, but you don't get to tell anybody else about how they should or should not be put together.
No, it's so true. It is so true. And I think that's a lot too with like kind of we see that online, right? Like the comments will like there'll be like a beautiful woman and he'll be like old.
Yeah.
And then you like look and it's just some crusty old man who looks like
Yeah.
shit. And it's like and it's like the comments, like you'll see like these nasty comments on these beautiful women's posts about every single detail of them. And then you click on this person and you're like, who are you to say anything about anybody? Go look in the mirror.
I saw a woman posting the other day and she said, I'm going to expose the people behind the comments. And her TikToks are essentially, I posted this photo of myself and I was just, with my kids, or I was doing this or I was doing that. And she's not using filters. She's not doing anything. She's a normal woman. She's beautiful. She's fine. And the people that were writing the comments were the most hideous men and women who are clearly not fit. They're not the healthiest of people that are around. And it's like, you wouldn't be judged except you're judging everybody else around you and writing hateful things. Just keep scrolling.
Right. The self-awareness sometimes is so low.
Can we change the topic?
Yes.
Let's talk about patriarchy. Anyway, Jenn, one of my favorite lines in your book, I have it, I'm going to read it, is the real goal is not just flipping the patriarchy, but evolving beyond it. And I love that you have that theme throughout your book, because there's so much discussion about gender, being a woman, being a man, what is it, whatever. But there's a lot of, I think, what we were talking about in terms of women over sexualizing or, treating, deciding that they're going to be the ones objectifying men, whatever it is. It's that idea of, okay, we're flipping the patriarchy. And I've always thought that's not the answer. Like, wouldn't the goal be, as you say, we all should be able to be who we are, and there's a place for us in society, and it doesn't mean anything, and we don't need to be canceled or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. That's really, this concept that it's like a lot of times we hear about like, oh, women should be in charge. And it's like, this is just going to create another issue the same way. Like it should just be the people who have certain traits and certain skills are good at certain things and should be in certain positions. And that should just be, even too, it's almost an overcorrection that is happening right now too. One, with like a bit of the feminist aspect of it. But then even now it's gone so many steps further with the gender conversation where now it's like you could be no gender. And then there's kind of some prejudice. Maybe prejudice isn't the word, but there's like judgment around like people who want to then have traditional roles, or people who do want to be feminine, or people who do want to be masculine, or people who do want to identify just as the way that they are and be able to just be. So we're in a very like overcorrecting point right now. And, there's that quote from Timothy Leary where he says, women who want to be equal with men lack ambition.
Hmm.
Like, so it's like,
Yeah.
this kind of getting to that point, it's like, it's not like, oh, now we need to be in the positions of power. It's like, no, just let everybody be. There are many things that men are still really good at and are probably a lot of times the best person for that. There's still things that women are really good at that they're probably still the best person for that. And then there's individuals who are outside of those norms who are really good for those things. So, yeah, I think, this kind of topic also they talk about this in some like different channeled messages where they say that the world used to be like a matriarchy, but a lot of people talk about that this matriarchy was like this perfect world, and it was not utopia. A lot of these things talk about how women then did not value men. They talk about it in Conversations with God. I believe they also talk about it in Bringers of the Dawn, where there was this time very long ago on this planet where allegedly men were just kind of like enslaved by women for like procreation and labor. And it was not great. It was not a good balanced place. It was not a great place to be. And even for the women, it wasn't great because even though they might have been the ones in power, we're never going to be like whole by oppressing or putting down anything else.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's a thing in terms of finding balance. And it's actually really difficult having that conversation with people. I've got girlfriends, one of my closest friends, she'll call me and, oh, the patriarchy. And I'm like, what's the patriarchy done to you? And she never has an answer. She's regurgitating something that some hardcore feminist has said. And so she's repeating it. And I'm just like, we need to find that balance. It doesn't need to be that we hate men and they're the root of all evil. It's finding that balance. And I feel like that's where a large part of this conversation is kind of missing at the moment, at least for me. I don't know how we get back there, but
Mm-hmm. Well, and you have a part in your book where you talk about the Fibonacci sequence, which I think is such a wonderful metaphor for this as well, that it takes the curves that are feminine and the lines that are more masculine to create the pattern of our world, right?
Right. And exactly too, even like kind of the stuff that is talked about in which I mentioned in that same chapter, the stuff that's from the Kabbalion, which talks about, this kind of law of the universe, which is, they call it a law of gender. I think the word gender has gotten so over-defined recently that maybe that's not the same meaning. But what they really mean is kind of like even the cell is feminine and masculine because we have a positive and a negative charge. So there is no life without the positive and negative charge. And so, we are living in this dualistic reality and there's nothing wrong with it. And these things both need each other in order to exist. Even too, I've talked about it in different videos where, this kind of whole escape the matrix thing, which is like a fun statement to say. But, again, Andrew Tate coming back to it, he talks about like the matrix and all of these things. So like matrix comes from matriarch. And it actually originally in the Bible, the way that they used matrix was to mean a womb. So this that we're in is like a womb. And then matrix, matriarch is connected to matter. So kind of where they talk about in like Hinduism, where Shiva is all, the masculine is all consciousness, it's everything, but it has no form until Shakti comes. Until the feminine comes, the masculine has no physical form. The masculine can't be physically in matter, in the matrix, without the matriarchal thing. So it's interesting that this kind of very misogynistic type of character, Andrew Tate, is so about escaping the matrix when the matrix is actually the feminine aspect of the universe, which allows us to have physical matter, which then we see mirrored in real life with like, there could be sperm everywhere, Not until it comes into the feminine, to the egg, can it be physical life and a new life, and a soul can come into it. So it's very interesting, we do need both to do anything. Nothing can happen without the other. As much as, whatever, there's these new things where people are like gonna like be able to grow babies in test tubes without the other, and all these new things that are happening. Who knows where that will end up?
Well, I guess if we can start cloning people, then you don't need both, right? I mean, you need to start with the matter that already has both, and then we can just clone people. That will end the patriarchy and matriarchy problem.
Right. That'll probably lead to Atlantis, like how they say that, like in Atlantis, that they abused the technology and that's why it had to be flooded.
Yeah.
I was going to say it'll end so well for all of us. So
Yeah.
just because we're running out of time, I have a controversial take
Okay.
on something, and I'm going to share it, and I'm happy for you to argue with me, even though you write about this at length in the book. So here's the thing. I have never had an issue with fairy tales. They've never bothered me, and I don't believe that they've colored my life and my vision for relationships moving forward. And in one chapter, you talk about Prince Charming and how he can't commit and he goes from relationship to relationship. And you talk about Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and all of that. And it was funny for me because I was reading it and went, I never looked at it that way. I always just assumed he was a different man. Like I always just thought there were lots of Prince Charmings running around and that was it. And I see the point that you were trying to make in terms of the fantasy that it promotes for where relationships are or where people think they need to go. Here's the thing for me. I think as a kid, when I was reading them or watching one of the movies, and I will say I am not a Disney fan in any way, shape, or form. I don't like any of the content they're putting out in modern day, but the old school fairy tales, I used to just love the story. And for me, it was more about the princess part of it versus the relationship. Whereas when I was thinking about relationships and dating and how awful it can be and the expectations, my whole thing goes to Danielle Steele novels and other romance novels. I remember reading them when I was, I don't know, 15 and 16 and just, oh, so great. It was so great. And then years later, I still remember which house I was in. So I had to be late 20s, early 30s. And my sister said, you should read this Danielle Steele book. And I said, okay. And the entire time I read it, my eyes were rolling so far back in my head that I was worried they were never going to come forward again because it was so bad. And I called my sister. I said, I cannot read this crap for another second. And she said, why is that? And I said, because in every book, talk about a perfect person. She's the Cinderella of the story. She's hard done by. Everybody loves her, but she's treated so poorly. And then she meets this man and they kiss and they look at each other and she says, darling, it's always been you. And he says, I knew from the moment I saw you. And then he takes her in one fell swoop. And then all of a sudden they're moving in unison and orgasms all around. And then that's it. And I'm like, that's the problem. That is not how any of this goes at all. And if sex is like that, like, no, it doesn't work. So then I started thinking about all the dating apps versus dating what it used to be. We could go back all the way, but let's just go back to the 80s when people would meet when they went to bars or clubs and you had to get a phone number from someone and you had to not lose the phone number and then you had to call them and you had to talk on the phone and there was effort put into dating versus dating apps now where everybody's disposable. If you don't put out and give me what I want, then there's somebody better and they're always searching for something better versus taking the time to actually get to know someone. So for me, I see the point you're making about the fairy tales, but like I said, I never grew up going, oh, this is what it's going to be. Whereas the dating apps and all these toxic people giving dating advice online. to me is what's more detrimental to all of that. I'm just curious as to your thoughts. I mean, I obviously know where you stand on the fairy tale thing, but I'm just curious.
Right. And, you know, too, with the fairy tales is that it's really kind of showing girls one thing and then teaching boys a different thing. So it's kind of like, even with the, you know, I talk about it also with kind of like the teen section as well, where it's like there's like these kind of Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, these kind of things. But then it's teaching boys to not be emotional, to not do these things. So it's kind of like they're being programmed to never be able to like satisfy each other. I was not a big Disney person myself, and my friend definitely, when she was going through that section, she's like, "You're gonna piss off some Disney people with this." She was like, "You're gonna make some Disney people really mad about this." I do think that, you know, there's kind of a lot of things. The Prince Charming is one aspect. The princess is another aspect of this kind of being young and virginal, being the only chosen one. Then kind of the other chapter about the Wicked Witch, where it's like, there's no other females that are, it's either like the evil stepsisters, this evil stepmom. They love the evil stepmom. There's never a good mom. The mom is always dead in all of those classics.
And they
then
often kill the father. I just have to say that.
Right. Yeah, and then there's also too, if there is like some good like female like guidance, it's either she's like a fairy godmother or a teapot or like some other thing that is not like a real other supportive woman. So it's kind of all of the flavors of what's happening. The Prince Charming is the one aspect. But yeah, then too, this modern stuff is also super, super like crazy because, you know, I mean, obviously the dating apps, like you said, and then the dating coaches, like one of these things that I see really going very viral lately that popping up on my stuff is like, oh, men, it's the vasopressin thing. I don't know if you've been seeing these videos. So all the dating coaches are talking about vasopressin, which is like a stress hormone that men release. And then they're like, oh, men fall in love through vasopressin. So the only way to get a man to fall in love with you is to stress him out. So now all of these dating coaches are now talking about like you must stress a man out in order to get him to be interested in you. And I'm like, I just don't think this is something that is long lasting or authentic, to say the least. And then like say something like Shira7, who I do follow Shira. I think she's so funny because she's very quick-witted, but her advice is not going to really lead to anyone's happiness. You know, she talks about the sprinkle, where it's like basically just getting a man, like it's kind of just like sugar daddy type stuff, how to get a man to basically pay your bills. And as much as the bills suck, as much as those bills hurt, they do hurt every month. But as much as that is the reality, you know, so a lot of this modern advice for women is super toxic at the same time, where it's kind of like stress them out, take their money, use them. And then we have on the other side, you know, men looking for the purity still, looking for young. And it's just like, again, both sides are not really like leading people to being able to find someone who's actually right for them.
I just want to say one last thing on the dating. I went out with a guy and I didn't even know this was a thing. He followed me out of Whole Foods and asked me out. I said, sure. It was when I'd first moved here. I didn't know many people. So I was like, yay, a night out. And we're sitting there and he said, I think I intimidated him, but he said, this is normally where I'd give you a backhanded compliment. And I looked at him and I said, why would you do that? And he said, well, if you do that, then she's trying to prove herself to you. And I went, okay. And I think I asked him what he would have said, and he might have told me. And he said, what would you have done? I said, I just would have gotten up and left. I wouldn't have said anything. And he goes, yeah, that's why I didn't do it. I said, you shouldn't be doing that to anyone. How is that advice? So you've got all these experts online giving advice about how to really mess with somebody's head in a time where there's a lot of people that are not emotionally or mentally stable. And it just creates this very, very, very toxic dating culture.
Right.
Yeah. I feel like, okay, so we're doomed with modern things going
No, we're
on.
not
Maybe we need some new
doomed.
fairy tales, but I do have to say something about the fairy tales thing. Back on that topic, was just, there was a stage in the 80s when Disney's princesses were trying, and maybe they're still doing that. I haven't seen things lately. But for a time they were being kind of pitched as stronger women, but the things that they were doing was crazy. So like Belle is a good example, that yes, she has book learning, she's going into town for the library or whatever, not she's not stressing out about the ball, but then she goes and gets trapped by this abusive beast, right? And then the other one is Ariel, was the one that really, I just thought, this is horrific that she gives up her voice. And I have friends who didn't agree with me at all. And I'm the only one that thinks, how could you literally have a female character who gives up her voice to be with a man? That was horrible. So
Right.
I do think there were some pretty toxic narratives right at that time.
Mhm. Yeah, they tried to do it a little bit better, like making them stronger and more like, because also, I mean, even like the Prince Charmings of all the other ones, they weren't really they were just rich kids. They were just born into rich family. Like they really weren't that charming actually. And they were always kissing people when they were asleep. Like it was a lot. There was a lot of toxic stuff. Even Jasmine, who was kind of like then the most strong, she like married basically like the Tinder swindler. Like it was just like Aladdin was like a lying little scheming guy, and so it was. But I do have to say too is, after writing this book and all of this stuff from the perspective that I had, then at the time of getting close to publishing it, then I met my husband, who honestly is like frozen in time. Like my sister jokes that it's like somebody just defrosted him because he is so like not like I don't know where. I mean, he was at war and stuff, so but he hasn't been out in the world and interacting much. So it was very nice, even like one of my friends was like, "Well, now should you take it back because now you have your little Prince Charming?" And I was like, I still stand by a lot that what I said, because there's a lot of people who need that advice that I needed to put together through that lens. But, I also really appreciated with this relationship that I'm in now. I had been celibate for 3 years before, and I was just like, didn't date anybody, didn't anything. I was like, I'm so done. And then even the ayahuasca that I did told me to just be a lesbian. So it didn't end up happening. But um I was like, "Well, maybe that's what's wrong. Maybe that's why I'm not finding anyone. Maybe that is the case." And but when I met him, it was very quick, and, we basically, like, it was very old school. It was like we were official, like, immediately, like, day 1, and it was, like, the same thing of, like, the phone numbers and, like, having to not to lose it because we were at sea, so it wasn't like we could, like, text right away because we weren't, like, on you know, we were, like, having, like, the Wi-Fi of the, cruise ship. But so it was also very interesting for me personally to kind of have an experience that I talk about in the book, like, of being not the realistic experience, because then myself, I did have the unrealistic kind of fairy tale experience of it. So it has changed me a lot. So after I feel like, this book is a capsule of being there, and it is really helpful for that. But I do feel a bit different now because now I actually, can be parts of myself that I haven't really been safe to be
Mhm.
before, with being feminine, with, just a lot of things. So, in a way, there is still fairy tales. And, the book was already done by that point that I got to say that part.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that, as you said, the Prince Charming characters, I realize it's probably written for girls most of the time, but they're so flat and unrealistic, and there aren't really good male characters being written. I'm trying to think who's the most dynamic and interesting male Disney character. And they're all either animals if they're men,
Right.
or live action, maybe. I mean, I'm sure they've done their studies and they've figured out it's useless to market to boys, but it's just, it would be nice to have more of the, I was thinking, what, you are married, more of your husband's type of men as characters. And I'm sure
Well, he's very shaped by the stuff I talk about in the masculinity chapter, which is like, he is in the military, so he is like, the army men and the putting your life on the line and getting like blasted up and shot and all of these things. So it's like kind of the male programming is really around, women's bodies are disposable for beauty, men's are disposable for function or like for some bigger purpose. And it's like, so he is very much programmed by those things, I mean, he grew up like loving Arnold Schwarzenegger and like Sylvester Stallone, and obviously looked up to all of those very like macho type of guys. So he is very shaped by masculine programming, but he luckily also had really good parents. So they really like, instilled some good values in him.
Yeah, that's great.
My favorite fairy tale that has come out, and I actually rewatched this Monday when I was flying back in from Nashville, was Frozen. And I don't know if that's actually Disney. And the reason I loved it is because her sister was the true love. The men were not. And I enjoyed one of the male characters. I can't even, I want to call him Hans. I don't even know what his name is though. That
I don't remember either. I don't remember.
You know the character I'm talking about. He's got the reindeer and they go off together, and he's this great masculine guy that's taking care of the divine feminine, but he's not that overbearing brute that wants anything other than to help and protect. And so when I was reading, I kept going, talk about Frozen. Talk about Frozen, because I feel like that's the one redeeming film in which they actually got the balance at least closer to being right.
And I actually never seen it. I kind of only address kind of the classics because I've never seen a lot of the modern ones. But from what I hear, a lot of the Disney and Pixar stuff now is very good from what I hear from people around like emotions and psychological stuff and balancing between people. Like I haven't really watched, I don't think I've seen really any of them, but people always tell me that they've shifted a lot in like the message.
Frozen 1, not Frozen 2. I was so disappointed with Frozen 2. And Frozen 1, I had never wanted to watch, but I was dating someone who was 10 years younger than me, and he watched a lot of animated films. And so I'm sitting there and he's like, you've got to watch this. And I went, I don't really care. And he put it on and I was so engrossed. But yet with that being said, I've never watched The Little Mermaid. I've never watched Aladdin. Or maybe I did. I think I watched it the night Robin Williams died. But yet I don't even remember it other than him.
He is the best part. The genie.
Yeah. But that was how much of an impact the movie had on me. I don't remember any of the story other than Robin Williams. So, okay. So we are out of time. Jenn, seriously, I think we could sit here and do a 6-hour show.
I know.
I love talking to you. I have so many questions here that we haven't even gotten to, but that's all right. It just means we'll have to do it again once you're in your new home base.
Yes. Once I'm in Louisiana, I would love to come back and talk about something else.
Great.
Amazing. Well, Jenn, thank you so much. For anybody that hasn't gotten it already, please go out and get Ken Not Included. It's such a great read and you will laugh a whole lot at some of these stories that Jenn shares with us. So Jenn, thank you for spending your Friday night with us. And Thank you for always doing this with me. And everyone that joined us live in the chat, thank you so much for spending your Friday night with us. Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.